Hey everybody, I'm Seth. I'm the pastor of Connection Discipleship here at Cassis.
And it's Savannah, and I'm the director of groups here at Cassis.
And we're here because this week we're starting a brand new study on the spiritual practices. And when we talk about spiritual practices, what we're talking about are things like prayer, maybe fasting, Bible study, and a bunch of other things. And the reason we wanted to do this is because what we found is when you start to integrate these things into your life, you start to find yourself becoming more and more like Jesus. And so you'll hear a lot of the what and the how and the why later on, but we just wanted to first just launch into what this may look like.
And whether you're new to spiritual practices or you've done this for some amount of time, we hope that by the end of this series, you'll at least know a little bit more about spiritual practices and maybe even incorporate some of the elements of one of these practices into your life.
So perhaps you've heard that old evangelism question. If you were to die tonight, where would your soul go? And it's this question that's meant to challenge us to think about, if I were to die tonight, would I be spending the rest of eternity in heaven or in hell? But if that's the way we approach these things, then it misses the whole idea of what does it mean to truly follow Jesus? Dallas Willard, this amazing author, he actually addresses this idea. And he says, most of us aren't going to die tonight. And so maybe the bigger question is, if you were to wake up tomorrow morning, what would you do? For Willard, the most important thing was how following Jesus impacts how we live our lives in the right here and the right now. And luckily, this is something that we get to see from the very moment that Jesus steps onto the scene. From the moment his ministry starts, he calls together these 12 guys and he says, come and follow me. And in doing so, you're going to learn what it means to live like me, love like me, and engage with the world around you like me. And this is so profound and important because to follow Jesus is to be like those guys, a disciple. And that means that we're going to learn to love and live and be more like Jesus as we do so. And it's that last line that really matters and is at the heart of this study. The idea of learning to do that all I do in the manner that Jesus did all that he did. And so in doing so, what we get to do is start to explore what these different practices are and how they draw us closer to Christ and make us more like him. And the great thing about that is that now all of a sudden we get to start to experience this thing that we've come to know as spiritual formation. Author John Mark Comer talks a lot about this idea of spiritual formation. He tells us that, spiritual formation isn't a Christian thing, it's just a human thing. And he challenges us to ask the question, not, am I being formed, but what am I being formed into? Who am I being formed into? So the thing is, spiritual formation, it's not an optional thing. We're shaped all the time, every day. Our thoughts, our emotions, our relationships, our habits, our attitudes, everything that is around us and in us, it helps shape us into something. And again, the point of this study is to be shaped into something deep and spiritual and very much like Christ. And so we want to ask the question again is, what are the things that I can engage with, the things that I can tackle that are going to help make that happen? And that's what we believe these spiritual practices do. And so during this study, when we talk about spiritual practices, what we'll mean is the things like prayer or Sabbath or fasting or reading the Bible or so many others. So the first thing that we want to do is kind of tackle and explore what the spiritual practices are, but also what they're not. And we're actually going to start with what they're not. The first what they're not is going to be the spiritual practices are not some spiritual barometer or metric. What I mean by that is we can sometimes think the more spiritual practices I do, or the more often I do some of these spiritual practices, like I'm praying all the time or fasting all the time, I'm becoming much more spiritual. And the truth is while these practices can help shape and again, form us and make us more mature and help us become more spiritual, they're not an indicator of our spiritual maturity or how deeply formed we are. Really, the only thing that's an indicator of our spiritual maturity and the deeply formedness that we have is how do we love? Our love for God, our love for others. When we can live out of that, then we know that we're starting to truly be deeply mature and formed. And it's those spiritual practices that help us get there. The second thing about spiritual practices is they're not meant to be a gloomy bore. I remember back when I was in maybe 5th grade, 6th grade, and I got this crazy idea in my head. I decided I'm going to read through the whole dictionary because I figured it's really important to know the meaning of every single word in the English language. You never know when that could come in handy. And so I would do this every night before bed. I'd sit down and I'd start to read through and I'd maybe tackle 5 or 10 words. And do you know how many nights I got into that? 2. Because I realized something after 2 nights. Reading the dictionary is exceptionally boring and depressing. and nobody should really be doing that. And this is kind of like how we approach spiritual practices sometimes. It's just, we got to get through it, and maybe they'll help us. And if we can just do it, even if they're super boring, that maybe something good's going to happen. And that's not what they're meant to be. They're meant to be something that bring us life. They're meant to be something that actually causes us to think and challenge us and bring a little bit of joy to our life as well.
As we end today, we want to give you some tips to starting the practices. The first, start where you are, not where you should be. Remember, this is a journey, not a race. Be honest with yourself and start there.
Another thing is take a balanced approach. This means that maybe don't jump into all of them all at once. This is a case where it's kind of like less is more, which means if there's one that appeals to you, do that one. If there's one that intimidates you, stay away from it.
Consider your season of life or stage of discipleship. Early on, you may have worked on developing yourself and your own beliefs, but as you became more solid in those beliefs, you would reach out and start to disciple others. You may also have life stages that are busier or harder than others. Don't make these something that makes the stage harder. These should add value to your life, not distract from it.
Another one would be to consider your personality and your spiritual temperament. This may mean that if you're an introvert, you're going to start doing ones that maybe give you some alone time, things that may require you to, read the Bible, meditate on it, prayer, but things that aren't going to be around all these other people. But if you're an extrovert, you're probably going to want to be doing stuff with people. This means maybe you're going out and celebrating or praying together or serving together or doing sorts of things that really bond and bring you together as a group. Either way, it doesn't matter. The thing is that God wants you to be able to approach Him exactly as you are and not who you aren't.
Do this in community. Community not only helps you have a sense of accountability, but there's a greater sense of togetherness. Those around you can help lift you up, and you do the same for others. Share what you've experienced with these practices with your community.
Lastly, remember, there's no formation without repetition. This means that you're going to have to realize change is slow. And oftentimes, in fact, you don't really see progress for a little bit. But this is okay. You're going to keep working through these things. And just remember, change is a slow and subtle thing. But in the end, you're going to become the person that you want to be and that God is calling you to be.
In your groups today, you'll get to talk to your group members about your experiences with spiritual practices, and maybe even the struggles that you've had with some of these spiritual practices in the past. Be honest with yourself and your group members about where you're at and where you'd like to go with these spiritual practices.